Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about this book. And it's just come out in German and in Spanish, and it came out this fall in French. So what I thought I'd do in the introductory moments to keep most time available for questions is just describe 4 or 5 of the major themes in the book. The book is really a continuation in some sense of some of my earlier work on inequality and globalization and financial markets, but it puts it into a slightly different perspective. So I begin with probably the oldest question in, let's say, modern economics, by going back to Adam Smith. He wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. We don't think of that as modern anymore, but still, the wealth of nations. And he asked the question, what gives rise to the wealth of nations? And we should remember that he was writing 240 years ago, before manufacturing, before the age of innovation, before all the modern economy. So he didn't really get it right. He talked to, his example was a pin factory, which was clearly not a good example of a modern economy. So I try to get it right first. So I begin by, what is the source of the wealth of nations? And I say, really, it goes back to the Enlightenment that was, at which he was playing a central role in creating. And there were 3 things that were really critical about the Enlightenment. It was a method of finding out about the nature of the universe around us, that we, science, okay? It was a finding about human nature, social sciences, and it was the creation of social institutions, markets with rule of law, democracies with separation of powers, and all the things that are under question today. But those elements of social organization that allowed large groups of people to cooperate together. A primitive agriculture economy, you didn't need much cooperation. You just had to have markets to exchange. But running a modern economy requires a high level of cooperation. And so these institutions of cooperation are absolutely essential. And just one aspect of this that relates to the political moment that we're in, I talk about the critical role of being able to ascertain what truth is to the functioning of these institutions. So you can't have your alternative facts in science. And that is relatively, that's an important issue in some of the debates that are going on today. The second point is that there's a major confusion between what gives rise to the wealth of nations and what gives rise to the wealth of the individual. An individual can get wealthy by stealing money from other people. And that doesn't make society better off, it makes society worse off. And then I argue that to a very large extent, the United States and some other advanced countries have become countries of in which of rank seekers. Rank seekers are people whose major objective is to get wealthy by taking a larger share of the pie rather than creating wealth. And I describe a variety of forms of exploitation that can occur, taking advantage of others, advantage of asymmetries of information, which is the area that I did my original research in, taking advantage of individual vulnerabilities, exploiting them in the way that Facebook and the other social media do, or exploiting market power. And there's a very big emphasis on the role of market power, and that's why the title "Power" comes in. But there is a growing consensus that the competitive model of the economy, that any of you who studied economics, it was the basic model, does not describe the United States economy today. If you look at sector after sector, there are a very few firms that dominate the market. And this is true particularly in the important sectors, the growing sectors. It's obviously true in the tech sector, but it's also true in little areas like dog food, drugstores. They may have many names, and so you may not realize that it's one company. But in New York, we have Duane Reade and Walgreen, and they're both owned by the same company. So you might think they're competing against each other, but they're obviously not. That's important because market power is one of the factors that explains the growing inequality. It also explains why the growth in the United States and in Europe is about two-thirds of what it was in the decades after World War II. And this is particularly surprising because we're supposed to be an innovation economy. And you think an innovation economy should have faster growth. In fact, we have slower growth. And one of the striking things is that what limited growth that has occurred has gone almost totally to the top. So if I were giving this in a normal lecture, I would have shown a chart where you would have seen a line at the bottom that looks like the horizontal axis. It looks like nothing changed. And in fact, it's not the horizontal axis, but it's the average income of the bottom 90%. And then you see another curve going way up, and that's the average income of the top 1%. So there's been a huge split over the last 40 years. The third theme is what has brought all of this about? Why has all these things come about? And what I argue is it can be attributed to, at least a large extent, to a set of ideas which in Europe is called neoliberalism, in the United States is called supply-side economics, that became fashionable around 1980. With Reagan in the United States, Thatcher in the UK, Schroeder in Germany. I mean, so everybody has their own personification. But this set of ideas, which basically said, strip away regulations, and that will free up the market, lower taxes at the top, and that will incentivize, and the result of that will be faster growth, and the growth will be sufficiently fast enough that it will mean that even the people at the bottom are going to be better off, and that don't worry about inequality. Yes, there'll be more inequality, but everybody will be better off. Well, that's sometimes called trickle-down economics. The one part of a couple parts of that turned out to be right was that inequality did grow, even better than they had thought. But trickle-down economics didn't work. United States is the worst representative of that. At the bottom, real wages adjusted for inflation, are the same as they were 60 years ago. And you know, when I give this kind of a talk, say in China, they can't believe that because 60 years ago, 40 years ago, their per capita income was $150. And now it's like $7,000. And so, you know, while we've at the bottom had this kind of stagnation, they've pulled 750 million people out of poverty. Even, you know, emblematic of what has happened is related to our politics is that the median income of a full-time male worker, and I talk about males because a lot of the politics is driven by angry males. The median income of a full-time male worker in the United States is the same as it was 42 years ago. So if you have understand the sense of frustration that they face, you know, in a country where there's supposed to be American dream, everybody getting better off, it's not true. And in fact, in the United States, not only is it the country with the highest level of inequality, it is among the countries with the lowest level of equality of opportunity. So that's the third thing, saying that the way the system got rejiggered in this last 40 years has led to lower growth, and all that growth has gone to the top. And I just want to remind you that 40 years is a long time. You know, there's a famous joke about Zhou Enlai being asked what was his view of the French Revolution, and his response was, it's too soon to tell. 40 years is long enough to say that that particular economic model has not worked. Capitalism, as we know it, is only there for a little over 200 years. We're talking about something like 20% of the history of capitalism. So the fourth idea is that what I call progressive capitalism is an answer to these problems. And in Europe, I would have used the word a rejuvenated social democracy. But for an American audience, they don't know what they don't know what democracy means, and therefore they don't know what social democracy. And since social sounds a little bit like socialism, their view is that it has to be bad. So I didn't want to use those words, but in many ways, these ideas are not foreign to the European conception. But a lot of what I'm arguing is that neoliberalism has infected Europe a great deal too, and the result of that is, the implication is that you need to rejuvenate a lot of European social democracy. So when I use the word progressive capitalism, I use that to emphasize that, in my view, you're going to need a market is going to be a central part. Capitalism is going to be a central part of this. But what I argue more broadly is that you need a new social contract between government, state, civil society, that we lost that balance in that neoliberal era that put the markets at top and really weakened both civil society and the role of the state. And I also try to emphasize that there ought to be, it's a little bit oversimplifies to talk just about the private sector and the public sector, that there needs to be a much richer ecology of institutions. So by that I mean, for instance, cooperatives are very important institutions. NGOs are very important institutions. If you ask what is one of the real strengths of the United States, it's our universities. I think that's widely recognized. There is no successful for-profit university. Emblematic of for-profit universities are Trump University, which excelled in the kind of exploitation I began to talk with, you know, and it had to settle fines of over $25 million. It was sued, you know, because it took advantage of people's aspirations to do well, but delivered them nothing. So all of our universities are successful. Most of them, the top ones, are foundations that are not-for-profits, and the others are, like Berkeley, are state universities. And so it really shows how important these institutions, not-for-profit, can be, but they're not really government in the way we think of it. They're very decentralized institutions. The only part of the US banking system that functioned well before the crisis and after the crisis were our co-ops. In the United States, the co-ops are called credit unions. They were the only people that did not engage in exploitation. They're the only people after the crisis that continued lending to small and medium-sized enterprises. So the idea here is that a well-functioning society has to have a wide variety of institutions, and different societies, the mix will be different, and the balance will be different, and that as time changes, that will have to change. But and each of these kinds of institutions have to operate as a check and balance against the other. There's one more aspect of this that that differs from, you might call it, standard economics, and that is the nature of our institutions, economic relations, shape who we are. that, for instance, cooperatives encourage cooperative behavior. And the ruthlessness of American-style capitalism, the winner takes all, has shaped America in many ways. And so when you see the problems, what I would call almost moral problems of many of our corporations, they're the predatory lending, discrimination by our banks, the pharmaceutical companies that pushed the opioid drugs that they knew were addictive and said that they weren't, the cigarette companies that pushed addictive cigarettes and said that they weren't, the food companies that pushed these foods that have led to an epidemic of childhood diabetes and resisted doing anything to curtail those. I could go on, but the point is that you would have thought that just a mild dose of morality would have stopped this kind of behavior. But when you have the kind of economic model that has characterized the United States, it's not a surprise that we wind up with this kind of behavior being quite systemic. And there's been a lot of studies trying to show that, in fact, our economic system does affect behavior. In fact, one amusing a set of these studies shows how studying economics in our current way we teach economics leads people to be more selfish. And the longer they study economics, the more selfish they become. So they become more like our economic models say they're supposed to be. And then finally, I try to describe what are the elements, concrete elements of this progressive capitalism. So part of the reason I wrote the book was to provide a platforms for some of the more progressive, for the Democratic Party as it was going into an election, to give them a structure to think about some of the things that they might push. And there are four elements of this that I'll talk about. One is rewriting the rules of capitalism. Every economy has to have regulations and rules. These are very important in shaping the economy. The rules, the weakening of the rules of monopoly have led to the growth of monopolies in the United States. Europe has done better on this in the last 20 years than the United States. Changing the rules on labor have led to a weakening of workers' bargaining position, and that's contributed to growth of inequality. The change in rules in corporate governance have led to this disproportionate pay gap. In the last 30 years, the ratio of the wages of CEOs has gone to ordinary workers from 30 to 1 to 300 to 1 in the United States. And it's not because they become 10 times more productive. European CEOs wish, I think, they could be like American CEOs, but they still are roughly 30 to 1, not 300 to 1. And it's not, again, the gap can't be explained by a difference in productivity. It's the corporate governance, norms, and laws. So there are a whole set of rules that you have to know that define our society. Very important set of rules I talk about. One are climate change, the environment. We have to live within our planetary boundaries. Another one, there are a whole set of rules that were just talked about in the previous earlier conversation today here by Brad Smith, talking about what are the rules for the new technologies. And it was very interesting. I found his talk really interesting because he came out and said very forcefully that the tech sector needs regulations. And he came out, advocating regulation. I mean, it was, and actually had some interesting ideas about how to regulate the tech sector. So those are all examples of the need for regulation. Markets don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be structured. The second is, obviously you need progressive expenditures. And this is particularly important in today's world where we have a lot of uncertainty, a lot of volatility, and markets don't provide adequate social protection. And we are a fast-changing society, and with a lot of structural change. And I try to explain in the book why it is that markets don't manage the structural change very well on their own. And the United States has done this, left it on its own. The result is all these areas that have been left behind. And it's clear that those countries that have tried to do a little bit better have succeeded in doing better. There are what are called place-based industrial policies and active labor market policies that can at least mitigate some of the tensions that grow as a result of advances in technology and globalization. So if you don't do that, you wind up with high levels of inequality, such as happened in the United States. A third area of expenditure that's really important goes back to the initial theme I talked about, is what makes for the wealth of nations, and it's advances in science. Those advances in technology all rest on basic research. And basic research is really a basic public good, and is really the foundations. You know, you start thinking about health, DNA, the internet, even the first browser was from the U.S. government, and this is a security company. It was done by DARPA, so it was even part of our security framework. But the point is that most of these advances in our standard of living rest on basic science. Basic science rests on foundations of public expenditures. But other areas that are really important in public expenditure are education, infrastructure, and unfortunately, many, right now where we haven't fully appreciated that. Proposals from the administration in the United States are to cut back on these basic public expenditures, which are the basis of the wealth of our nation. Obviously, and the third element is to finance these, you have to have progressive taxation. And many of our countries face regressive taxation. Warren Buffett put it well when he pointed out that he pays a lower tax rate than his secretary. And he said it was wrong. A lot of other people at the top say, well, that's wonderful, why not? But the thing is, I think it is a distortion. And things have gotten worse since he made that. I don't know how many of you know the December 2017 tax bill. It's called a tax cut. It was a tax cut for our corporations. It was a tax cut for the billionaires. A majority of Americans faced a tax increase. 70% of those in the middle, in a country which has the highest level of inequality, face a tax increase. And in a country where life expectancy is going down, the structure of the taxes resulted in millions of Americans more Americans going without health insurance. So you need, I mean, it really is important where we are now. And these issues I'm raising are highlighted by America, but a lot of other countries are facing similar issues. And finally, I try to explain that even if one follows the agenda I described, we might be able to restore economic growth, and the growth we would have would be more equitably shared. It would be a more shared prosperity. But the changes in our economy and our society are going to make it very difficult for large portions of the population to attain what they view, and what we all should view, as a basic modicum of a middle-class life. of a decent life. And you're going to need government assistance in education, health, retirement, housing, the basic necessities of life. Now, in Europe, many of these ideas are well accepted. United States is the only advanced country that doesn't recognize the right to access to health care as a basic human right. But there have been attacks against this, even in Europe. And so from a European audience, I've often emphasized, you should realize what you have and you should try to preserve it and strengthen it. Don't let it go. Many of you may not realize that student debt now in the United States is over $1.5 trillion. And that's what happens if you don't have good, strong government support for higher education. And in a modern innovation economy, that you would not encourage everybody to participate in, to get an education up to their potential, seems to me neither equitable but nor good for managing a prosperous society. So let me stop.